So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about how the presentation evolved, some general economic metrics. I like to call them metrics because now we're involved with venture capital companies. We used to call them numbers, but now they're metrics, so they sound more impressive. And we have some geographical markets we're going to talk about, the United States, of course Canada, because they're celebrating their 150th anniversary this year, and some international markets. We're going to talk about some economic markets, both industrial as well as infrastructure, and we'll try to do some forward-looking things also. It's even working great, perfect. So the evolution of the presentation, I was asked to make this presentation. We were doing small presentations when we had committee week, and we were talking about just kind of the general conditions of the industrial market because we're the Industrial Council, and since virtually all SAI members have an opportunity to secure business in the industrial market, whether it's swing stages or supported scaffold or systems or shoring, we just kind of talked about some of the economics and how that impacted that market and hopefully their opportunity to get some business there. So we have some various economic metrics we'll talk about. We'll talk about some politics more on a macro basis, and I'll try to be as apolitical as possible. And then we should talk a little bit before we get into it about the qualifications or lack thereof of the presenter. So I am not an economist, all right? I'm a fat old white guy from Wisconsin. So what do you know about Wisconsin? Well, so what do you know about? They have cheese, they have beer, right? They have the Packers, thank you. Last year the Badgers beat the LSU Tigers up at Lambeau Field to put that dreaded rumor that SEC football is better than Big Ten football. So and they're also noticed for one other thing. So if you look at by the Princeton Review, for 16 to 17, Wisconsin's the #1 party school. So again, that's very important. We were number 3 in 2016, but by sacrificing our lungs and liver and about 10 years of our life expectancy, we moved up to #1. So again, this is Wisconsin, okay? And here's a picture of a bunch of students at Wisconsin taking their final exam for quantitative statistics. You can see how dedicated we are in Wisconsin. Keep in mind, I'd like you to think of us more as drinkers and not necessarily thinkers, all right? So again, I'm not an economist. I'm just presenting some information. Hopefully we'll come to some good conclusions about it, but I'm just trying to be honest. So if you talk about some metrics for just a second, the U.S. metrics, unemployment is 4.3% for 2017. That's a 16-year low. In 2009, the unemployment rate in the United States was over 10%. In Canada, the unemployment rate is about 6.5%, and that's at an 8.5-year low from 2009 also. Inflation, in the United States, they use the base year of 82 to 84 as a base year, so that's a 100. Inflation's about 1.3% in 2017, so something that cost you $100 back in 82 to 84 would cost you $244.16 in 2017. Not bad for that number of years spread. In Canada, the base year that they used was 2002. For the same basket of goods, it would cost you $121 in 2012 and $130 in 2017. So you've got about a 1.6% inflation rate in 2017. Again, very low inflation for an extended period of time in both countries. So the cost of money, the federal fund rate in the United States is 1.25%. It's down about 0.5%. We had the first rate hike in 10 years and the second rate hike in June of 2017. Canada, similar. Bank of Canada monetary policy. The overnight rate, what banks charge each other, they just raised the benchmark rate in this month of this year up 0.25%. So again, relatively inexpensive money to try to go forward. And normally what happens in the past when money is relatively inexpensive, inflation tends to get higher. That hasn't happened here yet, okay? The exchange rate for the dollar is 90 cents to a euro. It's the highest rate in 14 years. The Chinese yuan is at an 8-year low. 1 to 6.81 yuan. The peso is 1 to 18. And partially because of the strong dollar in the world market, our construction machinery exports in 2016 were down 27%. So we have a new president. We'll see what kind of changes he is able to get done. A lot of things he thinks he wants to do. We'll see what he is able to accomplish. We have a 70-year-old president. The Canadians are led by a 45-year-old man. So their exchange rate is about 1 to 80 Canadian, $1 to 80 cent Canadian, and about 70 cent Canadian to the euro. The New York Stock Exchange, currently at about 21,000. In July of 2016, it was at 18,000. That's a 17% increase year over year. And if you look at July 2008, it was at 11,000, and you look at where it is today, it's about a 91% increase. Similar situation for the Canadian market. Currently 15,000. In July of 2016, it was at 14.3, or a 5% increase, and it's increased about 79% since 2008. There's a basket of stocks called the FANG, and that stands for Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Again, all these tech stocks. So the FANG, Facebook went public in 2012. It's risen 258% since then. Amazon, since 2009, is up over 1,300%. Netflix, since 2009, almost 2,600%. And Google, since 2009, almost 500%. So the old tech market that we did have a bust there for a while has come back and has gone very strong. So if you look at the U.S. Dow Jones Industrial Average, if you look at 2008 and 2009, where a lot of us old guys were wondering if we're ever going to be able to retire, the market, of course, has certainly recovered since then. Similar situation for the TSX Canadian Stock Exchange. Why are these numbers important? A lot of times for public companies, this is where they get their money, this is where they get their strength, this is how they're judged, earnings per share, so on and so forth. Cost of money for them is cheaper through this market. So if you start to take a look at the geographic market economies, the U.S. Economy is about $18 trillion, China's about $11 trillion, and Canada's about $1.6 trillion. So if you take a look at the 10 largest economies that are out there, they add up to about 66% of the world economy. So again, the United States is still the largest economy. China certainly growing fast, India growing very fast also. So we talk about some of the markets that we participate in. And in the industrial market, again, we deal with marine, power, refining and petrochemical, both upstream as well as downstream. So the marine shipbuilding industry in the United States, the U.S. has 275 ships right now, the smallest Navy they've had since 1917, which is the end of, right in the middle of the First World War. Sequestration has limited a lot of the investments that you would normally have in the marine industry. And even though we just saw that the United States has the world's largest economy, we build less than 10% of the new ships in the world. The Littoral Ship Program, which is a program that they're building these ships that are designed to be modular. They can take pieces off, put them back on. They're designed to go up rivers. That's been cut from 52 ships to 40 ships. It'll probably be cut again. We have two foreign-owned shipbuilders. One is Austal down in Alabama, and the other is Marinette Marine up in Wisconsin. And those are the two companies that are building the littoral ships. Bath Iron Works, last time they built the tankers was in 1980, and their only customer right now is the U.S. Navy. Now, everybody know what the Jones Act is? The Jones Act is an act where if you ship goods between United States ports, you're supposed to use United States manufactured ships as well as U.S. flagged ships. So is this important? Yeah, they just fined a company $10 million that moved a floating rig from the Gulf of Mexico up to Alaska, which is 2 U.S. ports, and because they didn't use a U.S. flagged ship, they got fined $10 million. Obviously, it's a way for the government to try to keep more shipbuilding here in the United States. Canada shipbuilding, 2017, Canada's last destroyer will be retired. They scrapped their last aircraft carrier in 1970, and they have a total of 29 ships. So they have the smallest navy of any G7 country, despite one of the longest coastlines in the world. They do have a large coast guard. They have 59 ships. They have commercial shipbuilding, primarily icebreakers and structures for offshore drilling over on the East Coast between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And the Canadian also has an act similar to the Jones Act, but they allow foreign shippers to pay a 25% penalty instead of a $10 million penalty. So worldwide, China is now the largest shipbuilding country, having overtaken Japan in 2006 to become number 2, and South Korea in 21 to become number 1. So China, by far, 30 million compensated gross tons built every year. Japan just passed up South Korea this year for the first time in 17 years. So that's where all the big shipbuilding is, but the shipbuilding industry in those countries has cut 20,000 workers in the last 2 years. So the marine industry going forward, there's some possible bright spots of some building of some LNG carriers to support the export of LNG from North America. The Saudis are going to spend about $6 billion for literal ships, for their own Coast Guard, and again, the Jones Act looks like it has teeth again now that people are getting fined $10 million. So that's the marine industry. If we start to talk about the electrical industry just a little bit, and again, many of us participate in the electrical industry, whether it's in power plants, transmission lines, or whatever. There's a list of United States electrical sources. Gas has overtaken coal. And in Canada, they're blessed with a lot of hydropower. So if you look at the United States, you can see that most of what we have right now is gas, closely followed by coal. Canada, again, very, very fortunate. 60% of their electricity is hydro-generated. So no carbon footprint, very little maintenance, very effective. Electric generation from fuels, you can see natural gas is going up, coal's going down, renewables are going up. So let's talk about the nuclear industry first, and it's 20% of the electrical generation in the United States. There's currently 99 reactors operating in 30 states by 30 different power companies. The facilities are closing faster than new reactors are being built. Indian Point, a major source of electricity just outside of New York City for 40 years, will close by 2021. 3 Mile Island is going to close. If you remember, they had an accident there. It's going to close if they don't get some state subsidies. Since October 2012, 14 reactor units at 11 plants have closed or announced closure. The average cost of $22 million annually, and average 86 full-time employees just to provide the requirements, the paperwork for the National Regulatory Commission. Not to operate the plant, not to do anything else productive, just to provide the paperwork. And the subsidies for new plants, but not existing plants. So if you have an existing plant, the government's not going to give you any money, but they're subsidizing the 2 new facilities being built down south. There's over 80 times less subsidies than there is for solar power per unit of energy generated. And Illinois and New York are kicking in $10 billion to try to keep their nuclear facilities open, to limit their fuel consumption. U.S. nuclear power going forward, Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents caused great discomfort and changed the rules quite a bit. In the U.S., you have 2 new facilities being constructed, each with 2 units for a total of 4 new units. You have Plant Vogtle, which has received $8.3 billion in loan guarantees and subsidies. And Toshiba bought Westinghouse not too long ago and went bankrupt in March of this year. And so they've agreed to pay the Southern Company $3.7 billion to finish the plant. Unfortunately, VC Summer also is a Westinghouse facility, so we'll see what kind of arrangement they come up with. They're very expensive to build. They take a long time to build, very complicated. Its study shows that nuclear operators are currently losing $2.5 billion annually. Plants sell electricity for $20 to $30 a megawatt, and it costs them $35 a megawatt. So it's tough to make money even on volume there. And so nuclear power will continue to decrease as an energy source as subsidies continue for other alternative energy. The Canadian nuclear industry, only 16%. They have 19 operating units, all but one in Ontario, and Quebec is scheduled to close. There's no new plants under construction, and quite honestly, Canada's going to get it out of the nuke business also. They have 2 plants approved, but they've deferred any kind of construction at all. So nuclear power going forward, there's 18 plants being decommissioned, plus an additional 6 plants. The closure announcements in the last 7 years, through 2050, 9.1 gigawatts of nuke power added, and 29 gigawatts of nuke power will be retired. So Energy's closing, Dominion is closing the Kewanee plant, Exxon's closing, Watts Bar #2 went online in 2016. 3 Mile Island, we talked about that, they're threatening to shut down. On the other hand, you have China, and they have 20 new reactors under construction and an additional 176 reactors proposed or planned, and they will overtake the United States as the largest nuclear generator by the year 2016. The problem you have is the Chinese. No, they're not. They're doing the subsidies again, Alan, and so on and so forth. And they don't have the regulations. The 86 people that you talk about just to do the paperwork and everything else, they don't have that. Another reason why they're building all the coal plants that they're building. They don't have the EPA and a whole bunch of other things. So, what's actually happening, because the decommissioning costs are increasing, some utilities are actually trying to kind of speed up the decision if they're going to decommission or not, because the costs just continue to escalate. That number you see, 20, 40, 60, that's billions of dollars that it costs to decommission plants. There's a Zion plant down in northern Illinois. It was decommissioned 20-some years ago. They're still working on it. Hanford Nuclear Facility in Hanford, Washington, where we had the first nuke work being done in World War II, they're still working on decommissioning that. It's the largest nuclear repository in the world. Hopefully they get it done before it flows into the Columbia River. So let's talk about coal for just a second. Coal is negatively impacted by low gas prices. It's impacted by pollution legislation for power plants. Gas is 43% less CO2 when compared to coal. Construction costs, even just for building new generating plants, are $57 a megawatt hour for gas compared to $95 a megawatt hour for coal, and it's primarily due to the cost of the technology again. Scrubbers, so on, to keep the pollution down. In the past 4 years, 29 coal plants in the U.S. switched to gas or biomass. Canada has announced the phase out of coal emissions completely by 2030, joining several other countries in eliminating coal as a fuel source. We already talked about the 29 plants closing down, and there's additional 54 units in the United States to be converted from coal to other fuel sources in the next 9 years. On the other hand, to Alan's point, China's building 1,171 more coal plants, an increase of 50%. Turkey's building 93 more coal plants, an increase of 166%. And India's building 446 more coal plants, an increase of 76%. So while we're going down, Europe's going down, certain countries are continuing to build coal plants. Coal going forward, PJM Interconnection manages a power grid from northern Illinois to New Jersey. The wholesale price of electricity is now $28.80 per megawatt hour. It's down over 50% from the 2008 rates. So almost like the scaffold industry, their rates are going down and their costs are going up. So what they're doing is because they have close natural gas close by, they're closing down the coal plants and switching over to natural gas. The demand for new plant construction down as people change actually the consumption of electricity also. So the prices are going down, the amount of electricity we're using is going down. So you can see the graphic here, coal generating capacity from 2016 to 2050 is scheduled to go way down. Gas-fired projects. New plants are being built with the assumption that cheaper gas would give a cost advantage. There are currently 233 projects from 2017 to 2030, representing about $83 billion that that are either being planned or in the process of getting started to being built. All right, let's talk a little bit about oil. Why do we talk about oil? Number one, it's where a lot of us get a lot of our business, whether it's upstream on offshore oil rigs, whether it's downstream in refineries or petrochemical plants. It's very important to our business. Some of the other reasons are it is the highest dollar commodity that's traded, much more than copper or steel or coffee or anything else. So in a worldwide market, it's the biggest commodity that's out there. One of the other reasons we talk about oil so much is because you have a lot of NOCs, national oil companies. You have companies like Petrobras down in Brazil, you have Pemex in Mexico, Ecopetrol, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, and these companies are basically government-run companies where the government gets a good portion of their source of revenue to run those countries. So this is consumption. Right now, consumption in the world is about 98 million barrels a day. So you can see the biggest pig out there is the United States at almost 20 million barrels a day. China's second, Japan, India, and then Russia. So U.S. refineries are very highly utilized right now. They're running at over 90%, but some of the problem that you've got is it's very difficult to get permitting to even do an expansion, much less try to do a new refinery. So they're running about as fast as they can for right now. North American oil production, we might get 9.9 million barrels a day for 2018 for the United States. There was a 21% decrease in CapEx by oil companies from 2014 to 2015. There was an additional 37% reduction in 2016, but there's been a 22% increase announced for 2017, most of it onshore for shale. Saudi Aramco now owns the largest refinery in the United States, the Gulf Coast Refinery in Port Arthur, Texas, 600,000 barrels a day. Fracking fund, right. Most of the increase in the rig count in the U.S. is from onshore fracking. So when they talk about rig counts, you know, it's important to differentiate what you have offshore and what you have onshore, and we'll talk about offshore in a little while, but most of the increase in rigs that is going on is onshore for fracking. You have many of the majors are actually divesting themselves of some other holdings to invest more in fracking because it's easier to get, there's a ready market for it, so on and so forth. The technology is getting better. Every 3.5 years, the rigs are able to produce twice as much oil or gas just because of technological improvements. In less than 10 years, the industry has gone from virtually $0 to $150 billion. Oil shale production, what they call tight oil, which is the oil that's trapped in the shale, is up from 5.6 million barrels a day by the end of 2017. It should be up another 1 million barrels over next year. Then the growth should slow down to about 500,000 barrels in 2018 as the drillers move to less productive areas. Those productivity gains we talk about tend to level off, and the U.S. shale production should reach about 9 million barrels a day by 2025. If world consumption stays at 98 million, you'll get almost 10% of the production just from shale. The oil industry internationally, oil demand and supply, close to balance at about 98 million barrels a day. Just having oil doesn't guarantee that you're going to do well. Venezuela has a national oil company called PDVSA. They have almost 300 billion barrels of oil reserves, second only to Saudi Arabia. And yet the country is just a disaster. The oil output dropped 30% in 2016 year over year. GDP is down 19%, and they have the world's worst inflation at 700%. Even though you have oil, you've got to manage it. So OPEC oil revenues, they're at their lowest in 12 years. Not too many years ago, we had $100 a barrel oil. What do we have now? $50, $45 a barrel oil, okay? Saudi's revenue from 2014 to 2016, their export revenues dropped 56%. Nigeria's dropped 78%, and Ecuador's dropped 52%. So again, if you're a government and you're getting a lot of your financing from your NOCs or your national oil companies, you better figure something out because you're taking a big hit. Oil going forward, Saudi Aramco has signed 13 agreements with United States companies for $50 billion worth of work over in Saudi. Saudi Aramco is expected to spend over $300 billion in the next decade. Keep in mind, they're talking about taking Aramco public, which we talked about the stock market before. As long as the stock market is good and strong, they'll be able to finance some of this work. The compliance of the OPEC members to production cuts, they recently extended the cuts of about 1.8 million barrels a day. For a while, they just kept churning out the oil. They thought they could run the frackers out of business. That program didn't work, so now they're trying to back off a little bit, trying to get the prices back up there. Very inexpensive cost of feedstock from hydraulic fracturing and natural gas makes the U.S. petrochemical industry very competitive internationally because their feedstock is very inexpensive and very close by. So oil going forward, the U.S. Gulf region will play a major role in increased crude oil exports for the United States, should rise 4 times to 2.25 million barrels a day from 2016 to 2020. The onshore region for the Gulf is doing very, very well. The increase in CapEx by oil majors for 2018 is going to go up. Chevron alone should spend about $20 million. 87% of what they're spending is going to be upstream, primarily LNG work in Australia as well as Kazakhstan, and then another 19% is going to be for the domestic shale work here in the United States. So the U.S. petrochemical capacity is expected to increase 70% from 2015 to 2018. The offshore industry, low utilization of existing platforms, very small backlog of building new platforms. The government revenue, when they have these auctions and they auction off blocks on the different coasts from the outer continental shelf, in 2008 it was $18 billion. In 2016 it was $2 billion. So people are doing shale instead of going offshore. Very expensive to get oil offshore. The U.S. government has appointed a new position, counselor to the Secretary for Energy Policy, to coordinate the efforts that span 10 different department bureaus. The goal is to open new energy sources, reduce bureaucratic roadblocks. So this is the utilization rate for offshore Gulf of Mexico rigs. I was down there about 2 months ago, and you can see all the rigs lined up very, very close to shore. The utilization is the lowest, as you can see, has been in many, many years. Offshore rig orders, you look at 2011, 2012, 2013, not too bad, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, there's almost no orders. And the orders that are out there, people are canceling. Very tough business nowadays. Upstream going forward, the rig count in the U.S., offshore is about 22, onshore up by 513, 413 in oil, 100 in gas, to 927 year over year. The rig count in Canada is about 99, 2/3 oil, 1/3 gas. And there's something called combustible ice or methane hydrate. And what this is it's actually methane that's trapped in the ice, and Japan and China are working on trying to mine it from the South China Sea. They're estimating reserves of 100,000 trillion cubic feet. That's from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And they're saying that while total worldwide production of natural gas was 2015, it was 124 billion cubic feet. So you compare that to the 100,000 trillion cubic feet. So they're hoping to be able to do a small scale production by 2020 and have commercial development by 2030. If they're successful with it, the methane hydrate could meet global gas demands for 800 years at the current consumption rates. So another place where they found an energy source that people don't even really think about. BP Thunder Horse, Gulf of Mexico, they are doing some investments. BP is investing Another $1 billion for the Thunder Horse expansion. So even though things are tough in the Gulf, some companies are investing. They're also doing a $9 billion investment in the second phase of the Mad Dog field, and they have 8 global projects expected to raise revenues $5 billion by the end of the decade. Other things going on, you've got 7 active, approved, under construction LNG facilities in the United States. 4 of them are approved in Canada, and none of them are on construction. So it's almost like the nuke industry. They had two approvals there, but they're not building anything yet. The DOT guarantees $2 billion in loans for carbon capture facility in Lake Charles. BIC claims U.S. refiners will increase CapEx by 38% in 2017 over 2016. And according to the IIR, there's 952 planned Gulf area projects, the highest level since 2010. And Husky Energy is going to build a $1.6 million White Rose West project offshore plant outside of Newfoundland. So there is still some work going on in the Gulf. The oil industry, upstream, not as strong as it was, but still plenty of work out there for you. What is growing? Solar is growing. It's one of the fastest growing industries in the last 7 years in the United States. And you can see the growth, and that's the U.S. on the graph there. In 2005, Canada produced no solar power, and in 2015, they produced 3,000 gigawatts. 98% of the solar production is in Ontario, primarily because of government incentives, the Ontario Green Energy Act. Solar electrical generation, the cost of photoelectric U.S. residential costs were cut in half from $6 a watt in 2010 to $3 a day. There's 300 gigawatts of solar PV capacity already installed globally, and Southern California Edison is seeing 5,000 plus PV systems added each month to their grid. And there's over 10 million homes in Germany that have solar power right now. The solar's going corporate. What's happened, even though Trump decided to get off of the council for environmental reasons, we do have some private agencies that are going ahead with their own solar programs. You can see the corporate over on the right and the state of offsite solar PPA market. U.S. Department of Energy Loan Office, there's $535 million loan to Soldara. They went bankrupt basically, and the LPO backed the first 5 solar farms in the United States. The solar electricity generated in the UK in the last 6 months has outpaced coal. There were several days in May where no electricity was generated from coal in the United Kingdom for the first time in over 200 years. And falling costs and continued government subsidies are going to help the solar industry. Panasonic's actually building 180-watt solar cells to mount on cars. They're testing them right now on the Prius hybrid, and Tesla may offer solar roofs on their new Model 3. So when you think about the 264 million cars and light trucks out there, there's a market for putting solar on top of vehicles. It's solar going forward. It takes 13 years to permit and build a nuclear plant. It takes 1 year to permit and build a solar 1 gigawatt plant. So where are you going to put your money? The solar employs about 175,000 people, more than coal or the steel industries. There's about $2.8 trillion worth of CapEx, 14 times current capacity by 2040. And the University of Virginia has a 25-year purchase for all solar electricity from Polar Solar Facility, Dominion Energy. They'll get 9% from there, and that'll add up to about a 21% total that they'll get from solar for all their engineering needs. The Saudis are also getting into solar so they can sell more of the oil that they have and get some of their energy from solar, as is Dubai, Jordan, and Oman. Wind power. Canada is the 7th largest producer of wind power in the world. The UK has more electricity from offshore wind than any other country. You've got Dominion and Dong, coastal Virginia offshore. They're building a wind project. They're going to have 6 megawatts of turbines by 2020. XL Energy hopes to have a 35% energy mix from wind in the next 2 years, and it should be their largest energy source by 2021. If you don't know where Xcel Energy is, they're in coal country, and they're going to have 35% of their energy mix from wind in the next 2 years. Offshore wind costs decrease as bigger turbines are developed. There's a 47% drop from now until 2040. Wind-generated electricity. In the U.S., 900 utility-scale turbines installed in the first quarter of 2017, 200 megawatts, the strongest start since 2009. This makes Colby happy here. We are in year 3 of the 5-year federal tax credit program, which of course are subsidies for the wind energy, and 99% of the wind farms are built in rural areas. The power purchase agreements by utilities, Fortune 500 companies, there were 1,781 megawatts of power signed in the first quarter of 2017, another record. So these are some of the wind areas in the United States that are really getting developed. The point is it's not just in one location. It's California, Texas, the Midwest, the Northeast, it's all over. And the wind reaches records of 50% or more powering regional grids. Infrastructure. Before we talk about infrastructure, does anybody remember the term shovel-ready project? That's what everybody does, they laugh. Because it was a program from the previous administration where we're going to have all those shovel-ready projects. Who got a bunch of work out of the shovel-ready projects? Anybody? Nobody. So that's what's scary. And I mention that because it's a little scary because when you start thinking about the buzzword now is infrastructure, and we're going to get all this money from infrastructure. Well, maybe we are, but the key to the infrastructure, of course, is how are you going to fund it? So just definition is infrastructure refers to the fundamental facilities and systems serving a country, city, or area, including the services and facilities necessary for its economy to function. It's typically characterized technical structures such as roads, bridges, tunnels, water supply, sewers, electrical grids, telecommunications, so forth. It can be defined as the physical components of interrelated systems providing commodities and services essential to enable, sustain, or enhance social living conditions. So when you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about what? Roads and subways, bridges. Yes, we put pipelines there because it's a choice for moving oil or gas. What are your other choices? Rail and trucking, which of course are infrastructure. Airports, railroads, ports, and waterways. So some of the historical attributes of infrastructure, if you will, we used to have a lot of federal assistance for funding. Many, many years ago, I was selling heavy equipment, and the government came out with a Revenue Sharing Act, whereby they would give money to different counties. Well, the counties didn't know what to do with all this money, so what they were doing is they were buying asphalt plants and concrete plants. They didn't need them, but they bought them, and pretty soon they were paving everything that was around there. Well, revenue sharing has pretty much gone away. Significant expenditures for the SAIA types of equipment and services because of the length of the project as well as the magnitude of the project. So in the past, for infrastructure projects, they were long-term and they were big. Good business for all of us folks in the business that we're in. They also had active private party participation, and they also had some local participation from the governments, both state and municipality. That's historical. So if we talk about the roadways and subways, the New York subway has 6 million riders a day. They have outdated technology. They began upgrading their signal system 20 years ago. In 20 years, they got one line done out of 22. Why is it slowed? Lack of funding. Everybody wants to keep the subway running because you get 6 million riders a day. How are you going to do this? Okay? So the point about this is this could cost about $20 billion in today's dollars, and that's if they get it done by 2045. This is infrastructure spending, but it's spending that folks in our business are probably going to get very little money out of. A rolling tower here, rolling tower there, but you're not going to see the massive scaffold structures or hoists like you see on a whole bunch of other projects. I don't know if you had a chance to watch the video. They have a video playing in the lobby of when they did some of the work in this facility. If you take a look at that video, you'll see like 2 Baker scaffolds and everything else is scissor lifts and boom lifts. So the construction practices are changing nowadays too. Again, $20 billion, but we probably will see very little bit of that money. U.S. roadways, they have the North Houston Highway. It's supposed to begin in 2020. That's about a $7 billion expedition. I don't know who gets a lot of business in roads. Not bridges, just roads. Not many of us. The DOT actually in Illinois sent home their workers because of unresolved state budget issues. So they have 900 transportation projects totaling $3.3 billion that they can't fund. They can't pay the workers. Canadian roadways, they have over 1 million kilometers of roadways, or 600,000 miles. They have a national highway system. They have investments of all different types of government. They average $4 to $6 billion a year in investments. They increase the amount of good roads and they decrease the amount of poor roads, and they are decreasing the unpaved roads by 26% a year. The current infrastructure realities, there's uncertainty or even cuts by the U.S. federal government. There's little participation by local governments because of budget issues, because they don't get any money from the federal government, and it's difficult to raise local taxes. The funding provided to address certain needs that require little or no SII supplied equipment or services. So nobody's helping us get some more business here. If you start to take a look, here's a sharp drop in government infrastructure spending from 2002 to 2014. It's almost fallen off a cliff, as you can see. Bridges, 5,500 plus bridges in the U.S. were found deficient according to the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. The Federal Highway Administration estimates annual investments of $20.5 billion over the next 16 years just to repair and replace the bridges that are deficient. Canada, the National Highway System, has 8,700 bridges. Over 60% are more than 30 years old, and 20% are over 50 years old. And that's usually the time limit that they're built to last, 50 years. Canada infrastructure funding, they do things a little bit differently. They have an infrastructure bank. They invest in infrastructure projects that have revenue-generating potential and are in the public interest. They attract private sector and institutional investors to projects so that more infrastructure can be built in Canada. They collect and share data to help governments make better decisions about infrastructure investments, and they should be operational in 2017. So they have a bridge right here, the Champlain Bridge, right here in Montreal, and they have the money in place for it. They're going to go ahead and get the work done. So that, again, the kind of the difference between the way the United States is funding work and the way Canada funds work. So you talk about pipelines for just a second. Canada can transport by pipeline 4 million barrels a day of oil and oil products, but we'll need to move 5.5 million barrels a day by 2030 due to the increase in production. 70% of the oil in the United States is moved by pipeline. 97% of the oil in Canada is moved by pipeline. So TransCanada is going ahead with their $2 billion Nova Gas transmission line, should begin construction in early 2019. I just got to see how I'm doing on time here. I don't want to cut our friend short here. I'm interested in that. So we have the Dakota Access Pipeline, began operating in June of 2017. That's the pipeline that goes from the Dakotas, where, again, all the shale production goes to Illinois, and from there it can go down south into the lower part of the United States to refineries. So it costs $3.8 billion, and they move about 500,000 barrels a day. As a comparison, if you would look to try to move that oil from the Bakken area, which is basically the Dakotas, to Washington State, it's going to cost you $9 a barrel by rail. If you send it east to the East Coast refineries, it's going to cost you $10 a barrel by rail. To move oil from West Texas to the refineries in the greater Houston area costs $3 a barrel. So you're looking at 3 times as much to move oil if you go by rail. as opposed to going by pipeline. All right, so Michigan, on the other side, Michigan wants to close a section of the pipeline that runs under the Mackinac Straits. There's 23 million gallons of oil and gas and LNG gas that daily go underneath the Mackinac Straits, and they want to close it down. The transatlantic pipeline, on the other hand, celebrated 40 years in service. Again, it's wonderful if you're able to find oil somewhere, whether it's the Bakken or the No Slope of Alaska. You got to get that oil from wherever you drill and get it from down to a refinery. So 40 years ago, they built the transatlantic pipeline up in Alaska, running from the North Slope down to Valdez, and it was privately funded, and so far it's transported 17 billion barrels of oil. We'll talk real quickly about the commercial market, and then we're just about out of time. It's primarily buildings, new and restorations. It's public, private, usually not residential. Years ago at Safeway, we used to track non-residential construction on a rolling 12-month average, and we would, based on some historical data, we would assign a number as to how much scaffolding dollars we could expect to get based on that square footage. What you have now is you have Hudson Yards development, a $20 billion development in New York City. It's the largest development since the Rockefeller Center. And you take a look at that, it's a nice looking development, but do you see any scaffold on there anywhere? You see hoists, you see boom lift, not much scaffold. And that's kind of what we're seeing now a lot nowadays. In the old days when you had buildings wrapped with scaffolding, that's normally not the way things are done nowadays. There's actually a new commercial construction index. We talked about the way we used to kind of track things, but the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and USG have partnered for a new economic metrics for commercial industries. The metrics are developed with Dodge data and analytics to survey contractors. Each quarter, Dodge will survey 2,700 commercial construction decision makers. They'll talk to them about backlogs, they'll talk to them about new business, and they'll talk about revenues. So you got an index of 0 to 100 reports directly to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Kind of looks like this. So there's the change in the backlog that you can see over here, increased, stable, decreased, and then this is the backlog itself. Less than 9 months, 52%. You go out 9 to 17 months, it drops to 31%, and 18 or more months and drops to 17%, which you normally would expect as you get a longer time horizon, the backlog will tend to drop off a little bit. So this is some new information that had not been traditionally available for the commercial market, so now it is available. One other thing to keep in mind, cats actually, when you start talking about, the masonry business used to be a great business for us in this industry. You had frames, you had frackles, you had all kinds of equipment. Cat's developing a robotic bricklayer, so I'm not so sure how much that's going to help us, but in the economy that we have right now with the difficulty in getting workers and everything else, Cat's out there developing robotic bricklaying. That's my presentation. If I can help with anything, let me know. I appreciate your attention and time.